Hello, historians. We are reading chapter 15. Today we'll be focusing on pages 2 through 11. Here is your intro video. Definitely check that out on your own. Let's begin. For most Americans and Minnesotans, life changed dramatically from the 1920s to the 1930s. The stories of a young jazz musician and a farm family illustrate the contrast between the jazz age 20s and the Great Depression of the 30s. Learn too about lifestyle changes for women, what happened when the money stopped flowing, and the government's response to economic crisis. So, our look for items and key terms here. These are great guides for your notes if you're taking your own notes. Our key terms that you'll want to be able to identify here on the right are stock market, Great Depression, prohibition, foreclosure, welfare, and New Deal. These will all be identified within the reading today. And then our look for items: what was the Great Depression? Name some ways the Great Depression impacted Minnesotans. What was the Jazz Age? How did lifestyles change for women during the 1920s and 1930s? What problems did farmers face during this time period? And what did private organizations and the government do to relieve the problems of the Great Depression? So by the end of our reading, not just today, but within all of the chapter 15 reading, we'll be able to answer those questions. So those can be a good guide for your notes. All right, so I won't go through the timeline, but feel free to check that out to see what else is going on during this time period. We do have a couple of our definitions over here in the bottom right-hand corner. The first is stock, a share of ownership in a company that can be bought and sold. We've got stock market, which is a place where stocks are bought and sold. So stocks are bought and sold within the stock market. So a Minnesotan named Wilbur Fauché had always admired the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. For years, he had dreamed of building an office tower modeled after the famous landmark. All he needed was a few $1,000,000. Where was he going to find that kind of money? In 1916, Fauché borrowed $6,000 and started buying up small companies that sold gas, electricity, and water. He combined these into one large company and then sold stock or shares in the ownership of that company. The shares of stock were bought and sold on the stock market. Investors liked Fauché's ideas. They bought stock, putting millions of dollars into his company. By 1927, Fauché had built a fortune of about $22 million, more than enough money to build that skyscraper he had been dreaming about. He decided to construct his office building in downtown Minneapolis. The people of Minneapolis watched with wonder as Fauché's tower rose higher and higher above the city's skyline. The magnificent structure was 32 stories high, making it the tallest building west of the Mississippi River. Because it seemed to prove that anything was possible, it symbolized people's hope for the future. In August 1929, Fauché held a 3-day celebration to mark the completion of the Fauché Tower. He was, as they say, on top of the world. Unfortunately, Fauché did not stay there for long. 2 months later, on October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed. Fauché's fortune, which was based on the value of his company's stock, disappeared. The money he had received from investors had already been spent on his company. By November, he was broke. So were many of the people who had invested in his company. So if you are taking notes using the template, we have our first question to answer here. Explain what happened in the fall of 1929 that caused Wilbur Fauché to go broke. So if we go back to that reading, we know what happened in 1829. The stock market crashed, and Fauché's fortune, which was based on the value of his company's stock, disappeared, right? So the stock market crash was a big factor in causing the Great Depression, which is what we're going to continue on with on this page. Here you can see the Fauché Tower. It still stands in downtown Minneapolis. It says Wilbur Fauché's skyscraper towered above the Minneapolis skyline when it was built in 1929. Because he idolized George Washington, Fauché modeled his building after the shape of the Washington Monument in the nation's capital city. The stock market crash of 1929 was a turning point from boom to bust in the history of the United States and Minnesota. Before the crash, the economy was booming. Many city dwellers believed that life was good and would only get better. Even farmers who struggled during the 1920s had hoped that better times were ahead. After the crash, everything was different. This bust started an economic crisis that we now call the Great Depression. It swept across the nation and touched lives throughout Minnesota, from cities to small towns to farms. And here we have our definition of the Great Depression. It's the 1930s economic crisis that began with the stock market crash of 1929, again, October of 1929. All right, so let's go back a bit now to before the crash, the Jazz Age. Okay, so Carl Warmington was 10 years old and living in Minneapolis when he first heard the new music that everyone seemed to be listening to after World War I. This uniquely American music was fast, happy, and fun. It came out of African American neighborhoods and in New Orleans, Louisiana, and St. Louis, Missouri, and spread across the nation over the radio and on phonographs. People called the music jazz, and they referred to the 1920s as the Jazz Age. And here we can see Carl Warmington performing at Breezy Point in northern Minnesota. So he is here, third from the left. Let's talk about the crash and the Great Depression, the impact that it had. Some Americans in the late 1920s saw the stock market as a way to get rich quickly. They could hardly be blamed for thinking that way. Investors bought shares in a business at a low price, and in a short time, they were worth a lot more. Stock prices were doubling and tripling. The investors could then turn around and sell those same stocks and make a large profit. More and more investors scrambled to buy shares in all sorts of companies without considering the risks. Many people spent all their savings on stocks. Others borrowed money to join the action. All that buying and selling of stocks ended with the crash. When people talk about the crash of 1929, they are referring to the sudden fall of stock prices and the panic that fed the collapse. All of a sudden, investors were scrambling to sell their stocks before they lost all their value. But investors couldn't sell if no one wanted to buy. With no buyers, the value of the stock sank lower and lower. The crash brought on a nationwide economic crisis that we now call the Great Depression. The year before the crash, a slight economic downturn had caused many businesses to lay off workers and cancel orders for new equipment. Without the crash, the downturn probably would have corrected itself. The crash caused people to panic. As more people lost their jobs and were unable to purchase goods, more businesses went bankrupt and had to close. That caused even more people to lose their jobs. Worried Americans began holding on to their money instead of spending it. The economy kept getting worse. The Great Depression lasted for more than a decade, and it touched all Americans, rich, poor, and in between. So our next set of notes here, what factors combined to cause the Great Depression include at least three. Well, we just read in that blue section of the Great Depression in the stock market, we read that investors, saw the stock market as a way to get rich quickly, and people spent all their money on stocks without considering the risks. And then, of course, in 1929, those stock prices fell, and investors scrambled to sell their stocks before they lost all their value, but they couldn't sell because no one wanted to buy. And with no buyers, the value of the stock sank lower and lower. So if people aren't spending money, what happens? What happens when money stops flowing? Well, take a look at this circular flow model down here. You've seen this in previous chapters showing how money and resources move within an economy. This time we'll use the model to help us understand what happens when money doesn't move within an economy. All parts of the circular flow model are connected. When the flow of one part gets interrupted, the other parts suffer too. Look at the top half of the model. It shows that households work for Minnesota industries, and those industries pay wages to the households. During the Great Depression, industries laid off employees. When that happened, both arrows slowed down and sometimes stopped flowing altogether. Some households no longer worked for Minnesota industries, and some Minnesota industries no longer paid households. As soon as the top arrows stopped flowing, they affected the bottom arrows. When households no longer had money to pay for goods and services, industries lost income. As a result, industries were no longer able to produce as many goods and services to sell. You may be familiar with the words recession and depression. Some economics Economists think of an economic recession as a time when the circular flow slows down and a depression as a time when the flow between the arrows is seriously interrupted. All right, and so this is something, again, that just shows, if you can't go to work, you don't get a wage, and if you don't have a wage, you probably aren't putting money, you're probably not buying things, you're probably not paying for services, and so the flow is seriously interrupted. All right, back to Carl Wormington here. As Wormington grew older, he spent hours and hours playing jazz records on his family's phonograph. Wormington wasn't satisfied just listening to jazz. He wanted to play jazz. He started taking trumpet lessons. Soon he was playing in amateur bands around the Twin Cities. In 1923, at the age of 15, Wormington joined a 10-piece youth orchestra that performed in theaters all over Minnesota. A few years later, he picked up the trombone. By the time he was attending the University of Minnesota, Wormington was earning good money as a trombonist in several dance bands. As he toured the theaters, resorts, and roadhouses of Minnesota, Wormington soaked up the giddy excitement of the jazz age. The country was at peace. Investors were getting rich in the stock market. Wormington noticed that attitudes were changing in this new era of jazz. All right, let's talk about lifestyle changes during the jazz age. We have another definition here on the right, which is prohibition. The period from 1920 to 1933 when the manufacture, transport, and sale of alcohol was illegal. One place jazz was played was in illegal bars called speakeasies. The bars were illegal because of prohibition. This period was the result of a constitutional amendment that prohibited or banned making and selling alcohol. In speakeasies, however, people drank and danced. Liquor was supplied in the speakeasies by bootlegger, people who made and sold illegal or bootleg alcohol. New intimate dancing styles such as the bunny hug were introduced. Wormington later recalled speakeasies and bootleggers became popular, and parties stimulated by illegal liquor took on more gaiety. Jazz music fit nicely into this new mood. So you'll want to have your notes open for this next section, or I'm going to fast forward a little bit to the prohibition section, but you want to identify what was prohibition, who was the Minnesotan who helped write the law, what was the year prohibition began, the year it ended, and then arguments for and against prohibition. So these are things that you should include in your notes as we go through this next section here. All right, so in 1919, there we go, first year, the U.S. Constitution was amended to ban the sale of liquor. This ban was called Prohibition, and it went into effect in 1920. So I guess that's the year it officially started, right? The law that officially made liquor sales legal was called the Volstead Act. It was named after Andrew Volstead, a Minnesota congressman who led the committee that wrote the law. All right, there's another piece of your notes. Prohibition supporters, such as members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, believed it would reduce drunkenness. They hoped prohibition would make the nation a better and safer place. It did not. So again, supporters wanted prohibition because they thought it would reduce the amount of people drinking and that it would make the nation better. If anything, prohibition made drinking alcohol more fashionable. Illegal saloons called speakeasies opened up in nearly every city. Gangsters moved in to control the supply of bootleg or illegal liquor. Minnesota was a perfect location for bootleggers. They smuggled or snuck liquor into Minnesota from Canada and sent it by train to St. Paul. Police raids like the one pictured here did little to control illegal liquor. Profits from this illegal activity turned several small-time bootleggers in St. Paul into powerful criminal bosses. They bribed city officials and police officers to protect their illegal bootleg business. Well-known gangsters like George Machine Gun Kelly Barnes and John Dillinger hid out in St. Paul because they knew that they would be safe. Gangster Alvin Creepy Karpis put it this way: "Of all the Midwest cities, the one that I knew best was St. Paul, and it was a crook's haven. Every criminal of any importance in the 1930s made his home at one time or another in St. Paul. If you were looking for a guy you hadn't seen for a few months, you usually thought of two places: prison or St. Paul. If he wasn't locked up in one, he was probably hanging out in the other." By the 1930s, most Americans believed that prohibition was a mistake. Drinking was still common and crime had increased because of illegal liquor sales. So crime actually increased as a result of prohibition, right? In 1933, Another date for you. The nation changed the Constitution again, this time to get rid of Prohibition. The bootleggers were out of business. St. Paul's gangster era soon came to an end. A couple cool resources for you to check out here as well.